Hello everyone. So I hope this works now. After taking a break for a while, we are having a few technical hiccups here. But yeah, we're trying to make the best out of it. So did you have to switch on YouTube to a different screen, or was it still the same? Okay, good. So then that's how it is. That's unfortunate. I hope that everyone finds over to this one here. The other one canceled on me. I have no clue why or what I did. And restarting the stream immediately set up. Well, that probably means that I need to do that a little bit more often. Sure that it actually good. So, how are you, everyone? I hope you grabbed your preferred beverage and that you're doing fine. So, as always, I've prepared a few comments on the blog that I will answer here on the stream, and I'm also answering questions here in the comments, of course. So whatever you want to ask, please post it into the chat, and I will do my best to answer that within the next, let's say, 55 minutes, probably. Good. One general thing before we dive into the questions. I've changed my settings a little bit. I hope that you will not be annoyed anymore by all the keyboard sounds that you usually heard. Please let me know how that works and if the audio quality is better. And without further ado, let's dive into the first question. Well, let's see. Okay, so here we have an article about association mappings, and I got a question from Varun who asked about the mapping of unidirectional one-to-many association, considering the following code snippet. So we have a one-to-many association with join column, the unidirectional one. That is something that is not recommended in general because the foreign key column is part of the many side of the association, and it makes it a little bit harder for Hibernate to implement this mapping if you model it as a unidirectional mapping on one side of the association, and it's handled pretty inefficiently. How does Hibernate know that the column FK order is in table order item and not order? Yeah, that's a thing that's a little bit confusing in the entity mapping here. We define the association on the order entity, one side of the association, and define a join column there. But on the table model, a one-to-many association, of course, is still modeled as an association or as a foreign key column on the many side of the whole association. So Hibernate automatically knows that the join column is on the many side of the application, even though we are modeling it on the one side. So let me quickly answer that. Here. So many-to-one or one-to-many association is always modeled as a foreign key on the many side the association table presents the many side. That Hibernate automatically knows that has to be of the no, as part of the order item table and not the order table. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the feedback. So the audio could be louder, or yeah, the only thing I can do about that is I put the microphone a little bit closer to my mouth and hope that that helps. And I try to speak a little bit louder. Okay, same from both. So Navid asks, what are common pitfalls in Hibernate that devs should be aware of? To be honest, there are quite a few. When working with Hibernate, you need to be aware that there's still a database that is handling the queries and storing the data and everything. So whenever you define a mapping that's very different to the table model, then this is probably not a great idea. The next thing you need to be aware of is that Hibernate and the object relational mapping hides a bunch of database operations. And it is very important that you monitor the database operations while you are implementing a new use case or changing an existing one. So please make sure that you activate Hibernate statistics and the logging of SQL statements to actually ensure that you see see all the statements Hibernate executes, and that you don't create an n+1 issue by for example. Let me try something else with the audio. With the output gain a little bit. Is that better now? So this should be a little bit louder now. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. So this one is about Dto projections with Jpa and Hibernate. Let's go down to the question. So hello, looking at the Dto projection for native SQL queries, code sample, you actually need an entity for the book to define SQL result set mapping, so it's not possible to use native SQL to Dto mapping without even defining entity class. Well, why should you use Hibernate if you're not using any entity? Not sure that I really understand this question here. So when you're using Hibernate and it's Dto mappings, projections, you should have at least one entity class in your project. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't use Hibernate, right? You can then define at the SQL side set mapping annotation to that entity does. Doesn't matter where you add the add that annotation, but you need to make sure that it's modified and by the startup. Okay, that's that, and take another look at the chat. Root, is it loud enough, or shall I increase the volume? So that's a common one thing I do not like in Hibernate. When we need to search in query, we need to use specification or query DSL. Both are useless, need a lot of effort to do. Secondly, the biggest challenge I face while playing with dates in query, there is no such default function like difference in date. Count days between two dates, need to use native code. Well, there are functions to work with dates. With Jpa and Hibernate as well. So it depends a little bit on what you want to do, but there are several things that are provided by Hibernate out of the box. So it depends on what you actually want to do in your query, but I'm pretty sure that most things should be doable with. And well, and the complaint about queries in general, I expect that is probably because you want to implement a complex query, and complex queries, yeah, are a little bit tricky with Hibernate. If you want to implement a really complex one, then you should take a look at native queries as you do already, or maybe use Juke, and then get it a Java API that actually helps you create native SQL statements. Yeah. So Kenway asks, is there any way of using Spring closed projections using complex type fields, for example, Polygon in Spring repositories? Good question. And I don't have a lot of experience with Hibernate Spatial, so I don't have a good answer to that question right now. With a closed projection, no, I would expect that's probably not possible. What you could try is to use a result transformer in Hibernate. You also find an article on my blog about that. So you're currently using the entity manager and unwrapping it to get the Hibernate query with the Scala type for the field. Yeah, that sounds like something that would be one of my first tries as well. I mean, the issue here as well as Hibernate Spatial is, of course, a Hibernate-specific extension of Hibernate and all the features provided by JPA. So the support that you have using the JPA Entity Manager is by nature pretty limited, right? So yeah, that sounds like visible. Okay, let's take a look at this one here. So this was an article about implementing equals and hash code with Hibernate. What questions do we have? When using a business key, we need to provide set key on the constructor of the entity each time we create one. Yeah, that's basically the idea of a business key. Seems like an inconvenience to me. For example, we would have to check if the key is unique among the transient and persistent entities of the same type. That's something I'm missing. the main thing here is that all of these things should be there by nature when using a business key. I mean, the main thing of a business key is that it's a unique identifier of an object or a thing in the real world. So you shouldn't even need to check if it's if that one is unique or not. Yes, you need to provide the business key when instantiating a new object. All business keys should be unique. Should be naturally unique, so that you don't to check if there's already checked that. Hold wrote Hibernate cache these sequences and assign it to entities accordingly if we are using sequences. How can we achieve it in PL/SQL where we cache and use it in the same way? Not sure if it's context. How can you do the same in PL/SQL? You wouldn't do that in PL/SQL. So what Hibernate does is Hibernate expects that, well, if you are defining a sequence generator on your entity class or some resistance layer, then by default its allocation size is set to 50. And then Hibernate expects that that sequence gets incremented in steps of 50, which means Hibernate can get a value from the sequence, then increment it 49 times internally without creating a duplicate before it gets the next value from the database. That reduces the number of required statements to get the next primary key value from 50 when inserting 50 entities to 1, which from a performance point of view is great. With PL/SQL, you wouldn't use that approach because with PL/SQL, you would probably get the next value from the sequence as part of your insert statement. But Hibernate splits that into two so that it is able to set the primary key value on the entity object and use it in its internal data structures, and at the same time to delay the execution of the insert statement as long as possible. Benefit from right behind optimization, to benefit from JDBC batching and stuff like that. So with PL/SQL, you would probably just not use it. And then there's another question. What do you think custom DTO projection is good for grid data or any DTO projection is most likely the most efficient way to retrieve and handle that data. In that case, you can explicitly specify which database fields you want to select with your query, and then you get back a result set, and Hibernate automatically instantiates the DTO object for each record in that result set. This usually dramatically reduces the number of selected database columns compared to selected entities, and it also reduces the overhead. Hibernate manages entities very efficiently, but there's still an overhead. Hibernate needs to perform dirty checks during flushes, needs to manage all its internal data structures and so on. So that takes a little bit of time. And you can get rid of that time by just using DTO projections, which are unmanaged. Entity projections, on the other hand, are a good fit for all write operations. That means whenever you need to change a record, you need to fetch an entity so that you can then change the entity attribute value. The entity goes through its internal lifecycle, and Hibernate sends the change at some point back to the database and produces the update in. Another situation in which an entity projection might be a good fit is whenever you need to work on a huge graph of entities and navigate it within your business logic. You can't do that with Dto projection. But even though you can do that with an entity projection, you need to be aware that fetching graphs of entities quite often resides in lots of queries, which are relatively inefficient because the execution of each and every SQL statement of course takes some time, and then by doing that slows down your. The next question from Grifter. Whenever I have time, I should create a video on Hibernate one-to-one bidirectional mappings with tables which have their own primary keys and are linked with foreign keys on either side. So I would say there should already be a video about that available. The end. Thanks for the info. I'm still trying to figure out how to set up the noise gate and everything here. I adjusted the setting. Hope it gets better now. Again, thanks for the info. Novak, I would love to take a look at the issue that you're teasering in your message, but I don't see the issue itself. I just see the question if I could take a look at it. So please try again to paste it in the chat. Grifter, you had only one-to-one mappings with a shared primary key. Okay, I definitely have an article about that. Okay. Check my sheet on that. So you should, Grifter, you should find something in the in this article. See that? Okay, now it works. Okay, let's take a quick look at the Novak's question on. Which not found. Huh? Let me try that again. So you're trying to write a test case for your REST control. Okay. That's this. Not fine. Go further on GitHub. Well, something went wrong. Okay. Loading the file. That doesn't look like a Jpa or Hibernate issue, to be honest. It looks more like there is an issue with your either with the REST endpoint or with the upload that we do here. Sorry, but I don't think that I'm the right one to help you with that question. But I'm pretty sure that someone else on Stack Overflow will know how to do that. Okay, there's another question about DTO mappings. How would you handle entities that are not always the same? For example, a user that has 3 to 5 fields based on endpoint use. In the DTO to entity mapping, well, I would use a different DTO projection for each endpoint and then separate queries to fetch exactly the information that you need for your use case. So I would use a query with a constructor expression, instantiate the DTO object that is expected by that endpoint, and then basically create a specific query for the endpoint. Why would I do that? There are multiple reasons for that. First of all, it keeps your endpoints separate from each other, which means that your entities in the backend and the different DTO classes that you use in your endpoints can evolve independently of each other. So you're reducing the risk of unexpected side effects when you change something. You also reduce the risk that you leak some internal details from your entity classes to the API. In addition to that, you get better performance because you are not selecting entities and because you're using a projection that is specifically designed for that use case and which has a hopefully very small overhead. Okay, next question from Phil. What would be the best approach when using Spring Hibernate to encrypt some table data into personal data such as addresses? To be able to search on them. Well, first of all, that would be a question that I would ask your DBA depending on the database that you are using, and ask your DBA team if there's an approach that they would prefer. They then might come up with the database function that you need to call when writing or reading that column. And you can then use that database function in what's that one called? It's example here. You can call it like a column. I think it's a column transform. A column transformer. Exactly. So there's the column transform annotation, and there you can define an SQL statement for read and for write operations. So For read, you could say you just read the book column, and for write, you could say you trim book. That would trim the value of the, well, that example here. We will probably do here in the comment. So when reading or writing the review, Hibernate would then use this part here. So when writing, it would apply the trim function to the value of the comment, and during read, it would just use just return the comment column. When you're using encryption, you would of course then use database functions to encrypt and decrypt the values whenever you're working with that database field. As I said, please. Oh. Let me try that again. Now with IDE. Okay, so there's the column transform annotation, and you can define a native SQL snippet for read and a native SQL snippet for write operations. And I would use this approach to then include the database function that is used by that's used by your database. So you're using typedef. That you can search on that data. So you're encrypting the data within the type, right? Within the user type. Yeah, that's a problem. But you can try this approach. That could probably. Not 100% sure. I haven't used that with encryption so far, but the column transformer should solve that issue. Another thing you could try is well, no, the data doesn't need to be encrypted in your model code. At least not for the query. It would be good enough if it gets automatically encrypted when performing the query. So as long as you use the same algorithm to encrypt your search term, then you should be able to search on the encrypted field. So as long as you automatically apply the encryption everywhere, that should work. Okay, let's take another look here at question. So how to use cache as the second level cache? Problem here. Well, that problem seems to be that the file isn't there. Please check if there is file called data folder in. So this is a pretty common issue that if you're referencing something from your Hibernate configuration, that you then have a path that doesn't work either in your test environment or in production, and it's always because this relative path reference just doesn't exist in a different environments because it depends on the path of. Michael has another question. What approach strategy advice would you give to a dev team considering switching to Jpa Hibernate on top of an existing database schema? Well, is the team familiar with Jpa and Hibernate? If not, then I would recommend to spend some time to get really familiar with Jpa and Hibernate before you do that switch. When you're doing the switch, then I would probably start by generating my entity classes based on the existing table model. And that is, of course, then a version that you will never deploy to production. But it's the first step on creating your table model. What I want to achieve here is that I want to have a class structure that will become my entity domain model, and where I already have all the class names in place, all the attribute names, and the basic mapping annotation. And I want to replace a few days of relatively stupid typing where I just hope that I don't misspell any column or class or table name with a few hours of it. After that is done, you of course adapt the entity mappings to fix common pitfalls, and after that you are probably already good to go. I mean, then you would start implementing SQL statements and JPQA statements on top of your new Hibernate and JPA based entity model. The most important step at the beginning is if your team isn't already familiar with JPA and Hibernate, then make sure that you invest the time to learn about the framework. I mean, that's the thing with all programming languages and frameworks, but the issue with modern frameworks is that they use a lot of smart defaults and that they're incredibly easy to use. Because of that, you can create a persistence layer that seems to work without actually understanding what it does internally. And quite often you will then recognize when you deploy the thing to production that it doesn't work as efficient or as reliable as you thought in the beginning. And that's quite often caused by some basic misunderstanding or in general a lack of knowledge about JP and Hibernate. So Igor asks, how would you synchronize data in an application between subdomain modules? Is application designed with domain-driven design? So for example, if two bounded contexts have entity user and the specific user is identified by the same ID, that these entities have partly same attributes in the bounded context. Good question. So we have two separate bounded contexts and two separate objects with the same ID that represent the same thing indeed. Where the easiest approach there is if you have one service that implements all the updates that are triggered by the user or some external process, and the other one that just replicates that information. And that would in general be my recommended approach. Define one service that implements all the write operations on that data and then replicate changes to the other service. This, of course, doesn't work if both services have a few information that the other service doesn't. And in that case, you need to implement the update use cases on both ends and then make sure that you synchronize in both directions. And that is something that's, to be honest, really hard to implement in a reliable and well-performing way. And that's why I would try to avoid that if possible. If you need to implement that, so if there's no way around that, you would need to think about how to implement error handling. So what happens if you have two concurrent modifications in both bounded contexts, which are probably implemented by two different services, and then you need to somehow merge them. Is there a service that is responsible for certain attributes and always contains and can act as a source of truth for a specific attribute? If yes, then you can use this information to merge these two updates together. But in general, that's a really tricky and tough thing to. Okay, so Wanderer 2097 asks, which one do you prefer for mapping composite ID, ID class or embedded ID, and why? So I prefer embedded IDs because it's the more powerful approach. And at least to me, the approach that looks more logical and natural. Let me check if I have an example here. I probably only have one for derived primary keys here. So with an embedded ID, we have an attribute on, in this case, our review entity of type of that embeddable, and we have an embedded ID annotation there that tells Hibernate, okay, this is an embeddable that acts as the representation of these. If we look here, then we see the embeddable. It has to implement serializable, and it has to have a default constructor and hash code implementation and the equals implementation. These are requirements by the JPA specification for all primary keys. But then we just have here the two attributes that are used as the primary keys, the username and the book ID. So this is a relatively simple class which you can then use in your test cases. For example, here to find a review by its primary. This is an approach that's relatively easy to understand when you use the entity class in your domain model. When you instantiate a new review object, you set the ID, and this is of course of type review ID, and you need to make sure to set both attributes on it. That's fine. You can use the ID class down here to search for it. If you would, this is the right one. If you would not use an embedded ID, then you would use these two attributes here. You have them here, have an ID attribute, and another one. And you would define an ID class up here. And that would be our review ID. So what happens here is you would set the username and the book ID directly on the review class. They might feel okay, but when you are searching here for the entity with a given ID, then you would still need to instantiate a review ID object, which it feels like we are breaking the overall concept here in some way. To me, it's way more natural to use the embedded ID, no ID plus. By doing that, you use the same approach down here to find something as well as to set the ID up. It has another advantage. Composite primary keys are often used with associations, and if you use an embedded ID, you can annotate your association with a maps ID annotation and tell Hibernate that the primary key, in this case of the associated book entity, is part of the primary key of the review entity. And in this case, it gets mapped to the book ID attribute. Hibernate does is when you set the association to the book entity, Hibernate takes the primary key of that object and sets it as the book ID value here on the review ID, which is a very common, simple, and powerful mapping for composite primary keys that are actually a derived primary key, so it depends on the value of another entity object. Okay. I think I answered all current questions in the chat. Let's answer another one on the blog, and then we probably end this stream for today. Okay, let's take this one here. So this is an article about overriding column mappings from the superclass, and you can do that with this attribute override annotation here. So my book entity extends the publication, and I rename the summary attribute and call it blurb for book, which is basically the text on the back of the book. Gives a quick. So I'm renaming the summary attribute that you can see here on the publication to blurb for the book by using this attribute override. What is the question? I would like to know how an attribute can be completely overwritten to be ignored using Hibernate annotations. I've tried to using transient on subclasses, but the annotated fields in the superclass remain noticed by Hibernate in schema creation. Did you want some inherited fields to be completely ignored by Hibernate, especially when I use desired Hibernate annotations? Annotated subclass fields in schema creation. Well, you can't do that. Unfortunately, you can't remove an entity attribute defined on the superclass on one of its subclasses. You can only change the name of the column. Yeah, that's a general thing with inheritance. If you define something on the superclass, you also have it on the subclass. There's no that. Okay. Then let's see, what questions do we have here? How to create a multi-server sequence generator. So the sequence generator there, well, Akash, the question here is, what do you actually want to achieve with that multi-server sequence generator? Do you want to create a sequence? No, do you want to share the same sequence with multiple application instances? So are you scaling your application horizontally? Or how do you want to use this multi-server sequence generator? If it's a multi-server approach on the database end, then you need to handle that on the database level. If it's something on the application level, then you don't need to worry about that. Hibernate requests the next sequence value in each instance of your application, and then uses that value and the database makes sure that it doesn't create any duplicates over the horizontally scaled. Ali asked, when would you use Updateable and Insertable in the property mapping of an entity? Well, I would use it when I would basically use it every time when I know that a column is not updatable or insertable. I mean, by default, all entity attributes are updatable and insertable. So if you have an attribute that gets only inserted but not updated, by all means, set updatable to false. I always say provide Hibernate as many information about your domain model as possible, and then give Hibernate the chance to apply optimizations whenever useful or necessary. And that would be a typical example. Mark asked, do you have any best practices for Hibernate in other caching systems like Apache Ignite or Redis? No, I have nothing on my YouTube channel or on the blog about that. That is an interesting topic for another article. So what would I recommend there? Well, Hibernate is relatively independent of the cache. Hibernate only defines an interface to the different caching solutions. So my first recommendation there would be use a cache that you're really familiar with and that you understand well, so that you can fine-tune it and make sure that it works reliably and efficient. And then my only recommendation would be make sure that if you're using the query cache, that you're keeping the query cache and the second level cache of your entity sync to avoid additional queries, just because the query cache contains entries that are no longer cached. Yeah, Alenka asked, has Hibernate some solution to work with Oracle stored procedure with parameters of type record? The only way to use them, excuse me. The only way to work with a record in a stored procedure would be to use a native query. In a native query, you can then do everything that your database supports. But with a stored procedure query or a name stored procedure query, there's no direct support for Hibernate for Oracle's records. And then Shanks asked if I've tried Kotlin with Spring Boot. Well, to be honest, not really. I've played around with Kotlin on a few evenings, and also played around with Kotlin in Spring, maybe for one evening or two, but that's nothing I'm really familiar with. So if you have any questions about it, then better ask someone else who has more experience with it, and who especially has used it in a real project. So I only used it, and it doesn't really. Okay, so let's say we have reached the end of the stream. Thanks a lot for attending, for asking all these questions and making the whole stream interesting. I hope you enjoyed it and got some value out of it. I will be back most likely next Wednesday with another Q&A stream, and then I will try to get a guest or two to join me in one of the following streams, as you had requested in my survey. But that would take a little bit to actually reach out to different people and Yeah. If you enjoyed the stream, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And then we see each other again in about a week. And if you need more detailed material about Jpa and Hibernate, take a look at the other free videos here on the stream. Take a look at my blog at thorbenjansen.com. And maybe take a look at my courses. If you are looking for a more structured introduction to Hibernate, either beginners or advanced features or performance optimizations, or maybe to working with microservices and ensure that you exchange your data in a reliable and scalable way. Okay. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the week. And see you guys soon. Bye.